Today is the roof topping of the LTower, which I designed. To design a successful tower, it's not just to design a tall tower. Happens to be a very, very tall tower. But it is really to create a sustainable tower, which means how it deals with energy consumption, what materials it uses. And of course, Toronto has wide ranges of weather, from very, very cold to very warm. So how do you use the right materials for such a building? But beyond that, it is a building that has to also have an identity. So it is not just a picture postcard view of a tall building from a distance, but how does the building feel at ground level? What kind of amenities does it offer to the public? And of course, in the case of the LTower, it's also connected to the Sony Theater, so that there is, and there's a public plaza, so there's a civic space that is part of the idea of the building. The way the building is shaped in the skyline is another element, of course, to create an identity and expressive quality of a building. In the case of the LTower, the building is shaped so that it doesn't throw shadows onto a park, which is very close in the neighborhood. So again, these are environmental factors that give the parameters to shape a building which is not just one more extruded box, but a building that really speaks a new language of architecture and creates a new impetus to see the skyline, to see the streets, and of course to offer the best possible living conditions to the inhabitants. Well, I think Toronto has to develop simultaneously both places to live, to work, to have a good life, but at the same time the infrastructure necessary to bring public transport to the center of the city so that people can really live in the center of the city without having to use their car. And of course that's really what makes a good city, because then you can have open public space, you can have parks, you can have the amenities that people need to live in a style that is necessary for a contemporary person. So certainly Toronto has very good infrastructure, but it's also a very spread out city, many suburbs and so on. So I think that the move to build in the center of Toronto, which we have seen in the last decade or 20 years, is recreating, I think, the idea of Toronto as a really great dynamic city. When you design a building, you have to, in my case, I never consider designing a building on a blank piece of paper. There is no blank piece of paper when you design a building. There is no tabula rasa, and where you start from zero. Cities have a rich history. Toronto has a rich history. Every city has a history. And I think to take that into account and rooting a building in the genius loci of a place, so that it is not something that can transpose between Toronto, London, Singapore, Beijing, Paris. It has to be a unique building, uniquely suited to the site, uniquely contoured, and not simply something mass-produced in a sort of global way. And particularly when we live in a global world, we need to worry about identity, because everything has become homogeneous, can become homogeneous. Therefore, I think there is more and more of an awareness that cities require a true individuality that is uniquely implicated in the history of a city. So when I design a city, I don't just design, the typology of a building, but one thinks of the poetry of the environment, the prose, of course, which is always there, the everyday life, but lifting the prose into a poetic space where people can enjoy and see a different perspective. And that goes not only for people who are lucky enough to live in a new building, but people on the streets who are far away from the building, for whom the building might create a different horizon, a different opportunity as well. So yes, all the buildings are intertwined in a city, and I think that's what I always think about when I design a building. Well, in Singapore, I had the opportunity to, I think there's 22 buildings, including 6 skyscrapers. Then I'm doing a site almost next to that building on Keppel Bay, which also has about 15 or 16 buildings. And that's a true opportunity and a kind of a visionary idea in city planning, where buildings are not just treated as if they were consumer items, but architects are asked to design an entire environment. So in case of Singapore, for example, it is a very high density environment, as I mentioned. Land values are very expensive. So of course, everyone has to pack maximum density, but to create individuality within the density, that is really the true art of the 21st century architecture, to give every person a unique view, a unique vista, a unique place in a large urban context. And of course, in Singapore, I have towers which are doubly curved, unprecedented, every tower, every one of the low-rise villas, which are about 15 stories high, they're not so low, also has a unique plan, and it takes unique opportunity to create a place. Of course, there are also bridges, green bridges, parks, which are brought very, very high up into skyscraper design, so that we can have open public space, not just on the ground level, but higher up, and of course making buildings which are sustainable and memorable. That's part of creating a neighborhood. So, of course, the skyscraper originated as simply an enlargement of a smaller building. That's the origin of the skyscraper in Chicago. You have a building, it grows taller. The next door you have a building that... But if you are now designing really skyscrapers, high buildings, we can really treat the environment in a totally different way. We're not just building taller buildings on a street, but recreating the ground plane as well, based on an individual, on what it feels like to be a human being amongst large-scale structures. That's very different. I recently completed a master plan in Korea, Seoul, in the city center, the Yongsan business district, which I call the archipelago, 21st century archipelago, which is again on a very small site, about 64 acres. There are more than 30 of the world's tallest skyscrapers, plus a business district, plus a transportation hub, plus residential, plus culture, plus a large retail valley that contains a kind of public movement. But there too, the design is based on breaking up the site into neighborhoods, giving a sense of open nature, and of course accommodating at the same time large groups of people who will live there, in the hundreds of thousands, and a large number of visitors. This will be a new city center in the center of a historical district. It's not out, in a new place. It's really where the 600-year-old history of the city has taken place. So, of course, cities are moving forward with more radical ideas of how to become sustainable and how to accommodate new desires of living, of working, of entertainment, of retail, of shopping, of culture. Well, I don't think there are fundamental differences between Toronto and Singapore. Both are metropolitan centers, both are cities that are highly successful, developing rapidly, one in Asia, one in North America. But I think the idea of density, the idea that to create a sustainable city, you cannot just spread the development as we did in the 20th century, into the suburbs and sort of eat up nature and really create a city that is not viable. The idea of whether it's Singapore or Toronto is to create a high density city where people have access to transportation, to culture, where they can work and walk and use public facilities, and of course create the kind of energy that is necessary to propel the city successfully, not just in economic terms, but in terms of human terms. So I think that's really, in many ways, the future of cities, with more than half the population of the globe now living in urban conditions, in cities. I think we have to really have a new approach to density and to quality of space and light and materials, so that people can really enjoy the city. And the city, of course, should always be based on the human scale and not on the scale of just large-scale buildings. Toronto has actually good weather. It says, global warming. I think it's clear that in a world of global warming, no city has the same climate that it had before. Cities that were very warm have shifts in temperature. It's the instability of weather that is really at the core of global warming, not just that the weather is warmer. So I think one has to really think again of how to design buildings. And of course that is part of a new awareness of what a sustainable building really is. Well, there are many new materials, there's a lot of research into new materials with new qualities. We live in a kind of a renaissance of the science of architecture, where people are realizing that old wall systems, old windows, old glazing is not really efficient any longer. We have to really, designing sustainable architecture is not a style. There is no, sustainable style of architecture. Many people might think that if you put green trees on top of a building, you've got sustainable architecture. It's really how you use the materials, how you use the logic of construction, and of course, research into innovation, innovative concrete, innovative systems that can be now accommodated in buildings. That's really what we do. And of course, in all the buildings, we have of course innovated with materials. And each building is different, each building is in a different place, so of course it has a different system of thinking about how to create carbon neutral buildings, buildings that have no emissions, buildings that save energy, buildings that can be maintained very easily given sort of economic framework of a building. But if you think about it, sustainability is not new. Great buildings that we admire in cities, in history, are sustainable because they're memorable, because they've been kept by generations and they continue to work. They were never made in order to be destroyed so rapidly. So the idea of buildings that become obsolete is now really questioned. So many buildings in our cities have been built by incorporating the cost of demolition in the original cost of the building, which showed that the buildings became just consumer items, not really sustainable in the long run. I think the return to the questions of architecture and city planning is a return to a new awareness that people have of the fact that cities are incredible works of art, really, made by many people over a long time, where everybody's co-contributor, not just the architects, but every citizen. And I think the democratization of cities, giving access to people, is not a sideline to the discussion. I think only in open, accessible cities where people and communities have really an input into planning and into architecture can we create really cities that are lasting.